Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about some really basic things as far as how to do ethics and some of the big ideas and the big concepts. Now, I'm just going to be introducing some of these ideas, and these ideas naturally get way more complicated. But I'm going to give you basic definitions of things in case you run into them into the readings, or in case, these are useful for you to use in the discussion of these ideas in your group projects or whatever else, okay? But I'm also going to begin this video with some critical thinking skills that I often teach in my general logic or critical thinking courses. If you're ever looking for just an interesting book to find about these types of things, I would recommend this book right here, which is You Are Not So Smart, and it's by David McRaney. It's short. It's kind of a pulpy paperback. It evolved from a blog that he started. I think that it's really fantastic. It mixes a lot of insights from, argumentation, but also psychology. And so we're going to delve into a little bit of that kind of stuff as well. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do tonight is to start with the WASON selection task. And this is named after the psychologist who developed this. So you know this for certain. I have a deck of cards, all right? And I tell you that on one side is a color and on the other side is a number. Okay, that applies to every single one of the cards. But I ask you whether there is one rule at play, okay? And that is, if a card has an even number on one side, then it must be read on the opposite side. So I'll say that again. If the card has an even number on one side, then it must be read on the opposite side. So the question is, which cards do you need to turn or to flip over in order to prove or disprove whether this rule holds, right? So obviously, if you turned over all four, you could figure this out. But assuming that you can turn over only less than four, right, and in as few as possible, which cards of those do you flip over to see whether that rule holds? Whether it holds that if a card has an even number on one side, then it must be read on the opposite side, okay? So you might pause the video here if you want to think about it, and then unpause it whenever you're ready. Okay, so I'm going to spoil the answer. Almost everyone gets that you should turn over the number 8. Why should you turn over the number 8? Well, if you turn over 8 and it has red on that side, then you know that it follows the rule. Alternatively, if you turn over 8 and there's any other color than red, you know that it breaks that rule. Okay, so almost everyone gets that. The next one, though, is the one that people usually forget. And it's that way fewer people, so only about 10% of the people in a 1977 iteration of this experiment got both cards that needed to be turned over. Almost everyone got 8. Very few people got that you needed brown. Why do you need to turn over brown? Well, if you turn over brown, right, if you find an odd number, it doesn't really matter, right? Because the rule isn't about odd numbers. But if you find an even number, then you have found a counterexample to that rule and you know that the rule is broken. So basically what this is it's a task that is very good at figuring out whether you are susceptible to confirmation bias, at least in this limited domain, okay? Confirmation bias is roughly the idea that most of us, whenever we're thinking, our pattern of thinking is such that we only look for information that confirms what we already believe, right? And this is also related to things that are called like the filter bubble or the algorithm bubble. Technology is making it more and more easy for us to only find information that proves our worldviews. But even when presented with a simple task like this, we often only look for the information that confirms our worldview. So let's go back to the 4 cards, right? Why don't you have to turn over the red card? Well, it doesn't matter what's on the other side. If it's an odd number, it doesn't have anything to do with that rule. And if it's an even number, it automatically follows the rule because that is red. right? So you don't have to turn over the red because it's irrelevant what's on the opposite side. And you don't have to turn over the 3 because, again, the rule isn't about odd numbers at all, okay? So you get that you have to turn over the 8 because it's an even number and you need to make sure that there's red. But many people forget that you need to turn over the brown because that is a potential condition that could break your rule, right? And so this task is basically designed to show that whenever we're trying to subject our ideas to scrutiny, we need to make sure to look for counterexamples. We need to look for stuff that might break our worldviews or the theories that we set forth, okay? But there was a second variation of this, right? And in this variation, basically we have a new scenario, and I just want to ask you, if this deck of cards represents an age on one side and a beverage on the other, and these people are drinking in a bar, and the legal drinking age is 21 years old, which people, if each of the cards represents one person, do you have to go up to try to figure out what their age is or what they're drinking to see whether the rule is being followed, right? And here, it's way easier. Almost everyone gets this, right? You don't have to turn over the soda. It doesn't matter how old someone is whenever they're drinking the soda. You don't have to turn over the 25 because that person could be drinking something non-alcoholic and then it doesn't matter, or they could be drinking something alcoholic and it doesn't matter because they're over the drinking age. The 2 people that you need to check in this particular scenario are the 16 because they're underage. So if they have an alcoholic drink, they break the rule, right? And you also have to check the person who's drinking the beer, right? Because if they're underage, obviously they're breaking the rule. So why does this matter, right? I think one side effect of this is that abstract thinking is really tough. Whenever we're dealing with even numbers and colors, right, our brains have a much harder time than dealing with a concrete scenario, okay? So the more abstract and complicated the problem gets, the more difficult it is for us to sort of understand what's going on. That kind of means that some of these abstract problems in philosophy, just make sure that you're slowing down because the abstract problems are going to be naturally tough for us to really understand. It's often going to help by illustrating things with a specific case or thinking of a specific case whenever you're thinking through particular theories. And the second thing is that confirmation bias is insidious, right? It's not good, and it's something that we can often ignore or miss, right? We need to be very, very careful whenever we're trying to look for why we believe what we believe, that we're actually not only trying to make sense of our theory in the sense of trying to build it up, but we're also doing due diligence to try to tear our theories down or look for alternative theories or try to entertain whether some other theory gets us the same things that we want out of a theory, but at far fewer costs, okay? I think that a lot of this is not necessarily our fault, right? Whenever I say that we all have biases, I don't mean that it's just like dumb people, right? Or I don't mean that it's people who are being careful. I think that it's all humans, okay? And it's because thinking is expensive. Your brain, weighs a little bit less than 3.5 pounds, okay? Yet, it uses about 20% of your body's energy, right? Your brain is not a fifth of your body's mass, yet it uses a fifth of your body's energy. It's a huge energy hog, right? It's a huge resource, but it's been something that's super advantageous to our survival, right? So thinking, and especially thinking very slowly and slowing things down and being systematic, that's really, really tough. It takes a ton of energy and it's just expensive, right? In the sense that it uses a lot of energy. And so in order to make thinking less rigorous or less tough, we just naturally have biases that are just basically patterns of thought. And we naturally use heuristics, which you can think of as basically shortcuts, okay? So whenever I say that, you have biases or whatever else, I don't mean to exclude myself. I, just as much as anyone else, have to deal with these types of things. No matter how rational you are or how rational you purport to be, these things are a problem. We just naturally have them ingrained in us, right? And we always need to make sure to realize that a lot of our patterns of thought, or a lot of the shortcuts that we use whenever we're thinking, these are kind of our default settings, okay? And I use the term default setting because it relates to one of the readings for tonight, which was David Foster Wallace's commencement speech, "This is Water." Now, I love this speech. Dave Foster Wallace can be a somewhat controversial figure in literature, but I think that he's really wonderful, and I think that this speech has some incredible insights, especially with relation to what we were just talking about. Confirmation bias, heuristics, basically operating life on autopilot, all right? And he is giving this talk at a very prestigious liberal arts college, and he's trying to talk about our default settings in education, all right? And I'm just going to read portions of his speech because I think that these are the most relevant, and I think that they're really, really well written. Okay? So he says, "I submit that this is what the real, no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperial alone, day in and day out." So Wallace realizes that we're sort of the center of our own experiences. Now, I know it's naturally an insult to say that you're self-centered, right? Or that, you're self-absorbed or whatever else. But whenever you're experiencing the world, we are in our heads, right? It's not like we have immediate access to someone's memories or experience or whatever else. It's not like we know a different way of thinking or a different way of experiencing the world. We have a way that's worked for us, and very rarely do we just automatically get taken out of that. We're just operating, we're going along. And he says education, hopefully, allows you to understand what your default setting is and make the decision whether you can change it. All right, so he goes on. Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan mother goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are what you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables. The skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Okay? Life is hard. And life right now is really, really weird. Okay? A lot of times we're just in survival mode. We're just trying to get by. And this is whenever we're relying on our biases or our heuristics, the patterns that have been successful to help us to survive up to this point, and the shortcuts that are useful, right? That we don't have to slow down. We can just operate in that quick, easy, fluent way, right? Not all people are like this, but a majority of us are a majority of the time, right? What Wallace is saying here is that education allows us to be critical of those things. He tries to say that, he's not trying to be the wise old person giving advice to the younger people, but he's just trying to be honest about the ways in which the values that we assume in our lives and perspective and the ways that we operate in the world, the ways that we think, the ways that we experience the world, those things often go unchallenged. And that can be a really big problem. We're going to see overlap with this with Aristotle. Aristotle says we all want to be happy. We just disagree about what happiness is, right? And why should we care about happiness? Well, it's because if we assume the wrong things about happiness, then we can end up making really bad life or death type decisions, or types of decisions that will affect our quality of life. Wallace is saying the same thing. If we worship beauty, we'll never be pretty enough, and it's basically an impossible task not to age, right? Whenever we worship wealth or material things, we'll never have enough, okay? It could be the same sort of thing, intellect, and you feel inadequate. Any number of things, right? So just be careful about the values that you assume. It's natural for us to just go along as though we've all been going along, because that's been successful so far. And it's natural for us, whenever we're looking into the world and reading things and trying to figure out what to do, that we only look at things that confirm our own beliefs, right? Confirmation bias, or that prove ourselves right. When in actuality, what we should be doing is probably looking for information that might disprove us, or looking at alternative theories, or opening ourselves up to alternative ways of experiencing the world. Okay, hopefully that's what this class is going to do. Hopefully that's what the multiple theories are going to do, the multiple applied debates that we're going to kind of talk about. But that's kind of the goal for the class, and that's why I think it's really important to entertain these ideas. Okay, so in order to do some of this, I included a short reading by Daniel Dennett from his book Intuition Pumps. All right. And I think that Dan Dennett, I think he's a really clear, and I think he's a great writer. And I think that he also hits on some very, very crucial things for all academic writing and academic thinking, but also for philosophy, or especially for philosophy. And the first one is what he calls Rappaport's rules, or what I most often will call, and other people will call, the principle of charity. Okay? And so this is the idea that before you criticize someone or a theory, you should be very, very careful, and you should do a few things. The first one is that you should reconstruct your opponent's argument. Okay? And ideally, you would reconstruct it in a way that your opponent could be like, wow, that's a really fantastic reconstruction. I didn't put it exactly in those words, right? Or maybe that's shorter than I would have put it, but that's pretty much what I said, and I completely agree with that. You're basically showing your opponent, and you're doing your own intellectual due diligence to basically understand the other side and make sure that you're getting at the real issues. If you do not reconstruct your opponent in a charitable way, then you're basically doing what's called the straw man fallacy. The straw man fallacy is basically creating something that resembles your opponent, but it's really easy to knock down. Okay, so it's called a straw man, like a scarecrow, because you could imagine it's really easy to defeat a scarecrow in a fight, whereas it's not easy to defeat another human being, right? But the straw person looks like a human, right? So to unaware audiences or from a distance, it's going to look as though you're doing something that resembles argumentation, but you're not really. And what makes the straw man fallacy so bad is that it doesn't get at any of the issues, right? If you actually want to get at the heart of the debate and to try to understand whether your ideas hold up or whether your opponent's ideas hold up, you actually need to find a good version of that particular argument. So the first step is just to reconstruct the argument as well as possible, right? And Dennett is going to add to this. He's going to say, basically try to state anywhere that you agree with your opponent, because typically, if we're paying attention to someone, especially in our class, because I've chosen the readings because I think that they're very intelligent people and they have something interesting to say, right? And he's also going to say, not only do you state agreement, but recap the learning. What have you learned from your opponent? Okay, so you've reconstructed their ideas. You say, hey, I already agree on this. Maybe it's just the question and not any part of the answer. And you recap what you've learned from your opponent, because you've probably learned something. Then and only then should you criticize. Okay? And so this idea, Rappaport's rules and the principle of charity, is designed to get you basically to get at the real issues and to make sure that you aren't treating your opponent unfairly. Okay? Now, inversely, okay, this doesn't mean that you have to entertain every single idea, and this doesn't mean that you need to debate someone who is arguing in bad faith. Okay, if the person has no interest in changing their minds, or if you think that they have no idea how they could be disproven, or if they say there's basically no evidence or anything that can change their minds, then, I'm not going to tell you not to argue with them. It's up to you. But I will say it's a lot harder to deal with that sort of thing, because it's not argumentation that's going to win someone like that over, right? So I'm not telling you to argue with just anyone. So like debating racists, for example. There are some people out there who have led very isolated lives, and maybe they're open to talking, and you can talk about these types of things. That could be a very fruitful conversation with some people. However, there are also a lot of people who are not open to changing their mind, right? You can't do anything to change their mind. We're going to see this, especially, this is an election year, right? You see that a lot in the way that people deal with these types of topics, right? So I'm not telling you which way to go or the other, but I am telling you that in order to interpret an opponent charitably, and in order to apply all of Rappaport's rules, it takes a lot of energy, and maybe you don't have that, right? So if you don't have unlimited energy, then sort of be aware of whether your opponent is interested in arguing and whether they're actually going to change their mind, okay? So that's the one caveat I'll give to this. But for this particular class, right, all of these readings are given in good faith, and especially me, you can always press me on things. I'm willing to change my mind or change my presentation or whatever else I can do to make the ideas better, or to like present the ideas in a better way, okay? This is just trying to apply this to real life, all right? So in addition to Rappaport's rules, I think he also gives us something really, really important, which is Sturgeons Law. And I love this because it basically says that 90% of everything is crap, 90% of everything is crud, or you could go even more vulgar than that, right? The idea here is that there's a lot of bad examples of theories out there, okay? The reason why this applies to this particular class, or even just life and politics in general, is that it's really easy to find bad examples. It's much, much harder to find good ones, okay? So whenever you're debating things, and especially whenever you're debating things of an opponent or someone who you don't agree with, or you just don't know anything about the domain, try to find that 10% and focus your energy there. There's going to be a lot of crap out there, a lot of crap. And it doesn't mean that you should dismiss things outright, but it does mean that try to compare as much as possible like to like. If you sincerely think something and you're engaging with someone who thinks something else, something that disproves you, right? Then maybe what they're saying isn't the best, but there is a better version out there. Try to find that version, right? There's a lot of crap. Try to let that go to the side. Try to focus on the best examples and deal with those ideas first and foremost. For philosophy and for philosophical writing, he talks about deepening in the reading, but he also talks about chmes in another reading. And so I just want to talk about these because they're kind of two extremes that I want you to avoid whenever you're thinking about things or whenever you're entertaining philosophy and certain other things, okay? So deepity is the idea that some philosophers and intellectuals, essay writers, literary people will write about really big, sexy topics that we all find really meaningful. Death, right? The meaning of life, art, these very profound things. But whenever they write extremely obscurely, such that you can't really understand them. Okay, so just because they're writing about really big, fancy concepts does not mean that they actually are saying something big and fancy and deep and profound. Some people use this to be charlatans, all right? They use it to pull wool over your eyes. Basically, just be very, very careful, because with this extreme of deepity, where someone is talking about really deep and profound topics, race, gender, death, life, meaning of life, beauty, right? They could have something really interesting to say, but they could just be relying on the sexiness of the topic, right? So just be very, very careful to consider those things deeply, because sometimes there is nothing there because it's a vacuous way of talking. They're using obscurity to cover up the fact that they have nothing to say or that there's nothing really of substance there, or the conclusion ends up being pretty obvious or trivial, okay? On the opposite side, and this is something that happens in philosophy as well, is something called chmes. So DENNETT says, imagine something like chess. If you know chess, you know that it's an 8x8 grid, right? And if you know all of the pieces and how they start and how they move and they take turns, you can literally work out every single hypothetical game, okay? In your head. You don't actually have to know whether people actually played these games. You know the rules. You know how people could theoretically move in response to them. You could play out every single hypothetical. But that is really unattached to reality. In philosophy, this is related to something we might call a tautology, something that is just by definition true, right? Often these things sound very circular. So my dog is a dog, right? That's true, but it's not really all that illuminating, right? So in CHMES, you can make these really tight, small, logical arguments that are technically true, but if they're detached from reality, if they're detached from all of those big, sexy topics, what does that matter, right? And so I think deepity represents the good thing about deepity is that it latches onto the things that we care about. It's attached to reality. It's talking about race, gender, the meaning of life, the stuff we care about, right? But it's not finding a very good way of expressing it, and it's actually not like telling us something that we don't already know in a lot of ways. CHMES is the opposite. So CHMES, what is really good about it is that it pays attention to being as clear as possible and as precise as possible with its language. You know exactly what's going on. You understand how the rules of the game work, right? It's very careful. It's very rigorous. It's not loose and fast. But the downside of CHMES is that it's detached. So what ideally we should do in this class, so whenever we're writing or whenever we're talking or whenever we're thinking about things, we should hopefully talk about things that are important, right? A different way of putting this is maybe you should try to find ideas that other intelligent people could disagree with, right? Some people call this sufficient controversy. So whenever you're talking about an idea or whenever you're arguing for something, try and think about the ways in which different people could disagree with you, okay? And if you can find that, then chances are you're kind of situating yourself in a debate and situating yourself in a way that something good could come out of that, right? But on the other hand, also be mindful of the way that you're expressing these ideas, because the way that you're expressing things matters. And for my part, I will argue very strongly that we should always try to argue as clearly as possible, right? I say write in a linear way. Try and make your sentences as short and as simple as possible. Try to, whenever you write, have a thesis at the beginning and make sure that all of your paragraphs relate to that thesis. Within an individual paragraph, make sure that you have one thesis for that paragraph and that all of the sentences somehow support that, okay? Now, I know that there are other ways of writing. That's fine. But what I often find is that in philosophy, if someone is trying to write poetically, then they're writing really bad poetry or really bad philosophy. Similarly, if they're writing in a sort of train of thought, freewheeling way, it's really, really tough for a reader. And I think that makes the philosophy and the ideas really inaccessible. And I would strongly caution you against doing that. And please don't do that for the sake of my class, but please don't do that in any academic writing. If you want to talk more about this, we can certainly talk more about this, okay? So DENNETT, how do we make sure that we're arguing virtuously? Make sure to follow Rappaport's rules or the principles of charity. Try to find the best examples of whatever your ideas or counter ideas, and really try to stay attached to reality, but also try to express things very, very clearly. Now, it's tough. Philosophy is hard. A lot of these ideas are tough to scrutinize, but it's worth the work, okay? So now that we have some basics of critical thinking, I'd like to just give a preview of the big normative theories that we're going to talk about in ethics. Now, normative ethics and ethics is way bigger than these, right? We could include a lot of other things. Notable absences really from our syllabi are things like Eastern ethics, so especially Confucian ethics or maybe Taoist ethics, maybe something from Indian ethics. Other things that we could talk about, feminist care ethics. There's a lot of other things that I could have included in this, but I've chosen not to for the sake of an introductory course like this, okay? What I've chosen are the three big normative theories: Aristotelian Virtue Ethics, Utilitarianism, and Kantian Deontology. These are historically the most influential in the Western world, so Western Europe, England, America, Australia. And I think also that they go deeper than that because they represent different ways of analyzing an action, okay? And so naturally, you aren't going to get all of what I'm saying here. All this is meant to be is to be an introduction to sort of whet your appetite, to sort of show you how these three big theories contrast with one another so that you can understand where they're coming from, okay? So the first one is virtue ethics, and in particular, Aristotelian virtue ethics. What this is, and what this is sometimes called, is a character-based ethic. What that means is what you're focused on here is the individual person and what kind of person they are, okay? Character as in character trait. What's your character? What's that person's character like? Maybe you need a character witness or a character recommendation. That's what we're trying to address in something like virtue ethics, okay? And here, it's called virtue ethics because virtue is basically the word for a good character trait. So if I ask if someone is virtuous, I mean that they've developed their character such that they're a good person. Not just that they've acted well at one time, but that they themselves reliably act in good ways most of the time, right? They have a disposition or a habit to be a good person. The opposite of this is a vice, and a vice is a bad character trait. And again, it's not that someone makes a mistake or does something bad. Rather, it's that with respect to some domain in life, they have some sort of habit that disposes them to do bad things, right? And so in addition to character, the traits that we develop in ourselves, the habits, the personality traits, we also, in Aristotelian virtue ethics, want to focus in on the question of happiness or flourishing. These are both two ways of talking about Aristotle's word eudaimonia. And you can think of this as what is the good or meaningful life? What is the best life to lead? If you go out into your community and you try to look at people whose life or who might you want to switch places with, right? Whose life might you want to lead? That's what we care about when we're thinking about happiness. And this basically leads to two operative questions. One operative question is, what kind of life do I want to lead? So this is the question of happiness or flourishing, right? Aristotle thinks that we all want to be happy. We all have some idea of what would make our lives good and meaningful, of things that we should strive after, the things that we model our lives after, our most long-term project. Happiness does not mean a short-term emotional state, right? It's not about whether you feel happy. Rather, what he means by happiness is something like a long-term accomplishment of a life lived well. It's a complete life that's missing nothing, okay? So the first question that we need to ask is, what kind of life do we want to lead, right? Aristotle is going to think that everyone wants certain things, right? But maybe you can make this a more subjective thing and just think about your own life. And then the second question is about the character traits or the virtues and the vices. What kind of person do I need to become in order to lead that life, in order to do that thing, okay? So that's virtue ethics. Whenever we're assessing something, we do it from the perspective of assessing someone's character and how that affects basically their life's trajectory, all right? This is in contrast to the next two theories, which are act-based theories. The first one is utilitarianism, okay? And you might have been able to deduce that Aristotle was the person on the last slide. This head here belongs to Jeremy Bentham, and I put it here because it's strange, but it's also like a really interesting story in philosophy. Jeremy Bentham is a British guy. He was very rich, very well off, and he decided that basically he was going to give a lot of his money to a university, right? But on the condition that his body be mummified and basically preserved at that university and basically displayed, right? And so they did that, right? They were able to do that pretty easily with his body, his skeleton, etc. But you have to be very, very careful whenever it comes to trying to preserve someone's head, because facial recognition is kind of how we recognize a lot of people, right? And so the person that they got to preserve Jeremy Bentham's head decided to try out a new technique. Well, he messed it up. And what it ended up doing is tanning the skin and making the skin basically like really dry and really taut. And that is Jeremy Bentham's head, right? Now there's sort of apocryphal tales about rival universities going and stealing Bentham's head. And I think they held it for ransom. And then, you know, the university where it's housed asked them to make they asked the university where it was housed to make a donation to a charity, and they did that, and so they returned the head, right? Jeremy Bentham's head is something of folklore, and I wanted to introduce you to that because Jeremy Bentham, along with his student John Stuart Mill, are the people who talked about utilitarianism. And here, what you're most focused on whenever you're trying to decide what to do is what the consequences of a particular action are. So the action itself doesn't really matter, and the person, you know, the shape of their life or their character traits, those things don't really matter. What matters the most whenever you're trying to figure stuff out is what happens as a result of the action. So if you do this thing, right, or if you're entertaining multiple options, what could happen as a result? The consequences, that's what matters. It's about the ends, not so much the means, okay? And again, just talking in generalities here, things get really complicated, but just here it's focused on what are the goals, what are the consequences. And the short, pithy saying is the greatest good for the greatest number involved. So whenever you're looking at the consequences for utilitarians, what you want to do is to do the thing that maximizes the good and minimizes the bad. And not just for yourself, this isn't egoistic, okay? Everyone's good counts for the same. Everyone's bad counts for the same. And insofar as this action leads to consequences for people, it has to be factored in, okay? So utilitarians, whenever you're asking, should I do this thing? You ask, well, what are the consequences? And does it maximize the good for everyone involved? And if there's not really a good option, does it at least minimize the bad for everyone involved? Now, the big debate in utilitarianism, or the bigger, broader theory as consequentialism, is what is the good or what is the bad, right? What are we trying to maximize and minimize? Jeremy Bentham thought that the good was pleasure and that the bad was pain. So whenever we're acting such that most people experience the most amount of pleasure and avoid the most amount of pain, right? His student, John Stuart Mill, thinks that the good is happiness and the bad is unhappiness, okay? So instead of, you know, measuring things in terms of like brute sensation, right? Pleasure and pain, he thinks that we should kind of do it kind of like Aristotle, right? Consider the scope of a life and consider the things that make lives go better, all right? But generally, the idea is focus on the consequences, maximize the good, minimize the bad for everyone involved. You're focused on what happens as a result, and the results, maximizing and getting the best results, that's what justifies your particular action, okay? Here, we're concerned with what's called instrumental value, okay? So an action does not have a rightness or a wrongness in and of itself. So, for example, to murder someone is not right or wrong in and of itself. What makes something right or wrong is whether it leads to good or bad consequences, okay? Why is something like murder bad typically? Well, because it leads to a lot of pain, not just for the victim, but for an entire community and maybe even to the person who's doing that thing, right? So the justification isn't on the action itself, it's on all of the results that follow from the action, okay? This is in stark contrast to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant formed a type of deontology that we're going to call Kantian Deontology or Kantian Ethics, right? And rather than being focused on the consequences of an action, we're looking at the action itself, and we're looking basically, like if you want to think of utilitarianism as looking at the action and everything that happens afterward, Kantians are looking at the action and the psychology of the person before it. Okay, what is their will like? What desires do they have? What will they do in a given scenario? And what are the reasons that they have for doing what they're doing? Okay, and in deontology, the easy way to remember this is because deontology begins with D. Deontology is most focused on duties, right? The things that we just should and shouldn't do intrinsically. You don't have to ask whether the consequences of murdering someone, like an innocent person, are good or bad. You just don't do that. Why don't you do that? Well, because it's deeply irrational on some interpretations, or it just doesn't respect the dignity of people. Okay? That's how Kantians are going to deal with stuff. They're going to look at the action, and they're going to look at whether someone can be rational whenever they do that, and whether they are respecting the dignity of other people while doing those things. Here, instead of instrumental value, we're concerned with intrinsic value. Intrinsic value means that the action in and of itself, or the thing in and of itself, has some type of value, and it doesn't have to be concerned with what it's good for. Certain things are just right, certain things are just wrong. Okay? So those are the big three theories, right? Aristotelian virtue ethics, you're focused on the character of a person. You have these big overarching questions. What kind of life do I want to lead? And what kind of person do I need to become? And if I'm trying to decide what to do as an Aristotelian virtue ethicist, I need to ask, what kind of person did this make me? Can I live with this? How does this affect my life plans and how will I flourish, right? For the utilitarian, what you're trying to do is maximize the good and minimize the bad. If I'm trying to consider what to do, I want to know, who is this action affecting, and are the effects good or bad? How can I maximize the good for everyone involved or minimize the bad for everyone involved? For the deontologist, you're focusing on the action, but you're focusing on, is it rational for me to want to do these things or to will to do these things, right? Or do I have good reasons? And whenever I'm doing these things, is it respecting the dignity and the humanity of any people involved? Okay? So let's talk about a test case. And this is a test case because it's very strange, but it's also kind of one of my favorites from medical history, if you want to call this medicine. This is John R. Brinkley. And he lived, in the 1900s, and he always wanted to be a doctor. And so he tried to train, although he wasn't really all that successful. And he actually ended up buying a certificate in medicine from a degree mill, more or less, okay? But what's kind of interesting is that in 1918, when the flu pandemic hit, there are reports that he actually helped a lot of people, okay? He helped treat them. But he's most famous, or maybe infamous, for a way that he made a lot of money and gained a lot of social and political influence. Namely, he found a cure for erectile dysfunction, aka impotence, aka, sexual problems. Basically, men who couldn't get erections or who couldn't, orgasm, right? But the catch is, the cure was that he took slices of goat testicle and implanted it into the scrotum of the men with erectile dysfunction. Okay? And again, he doesn't have really proper medical credentials. He wasn't like the best practitioner of medicine. So a lot of people got infections and died. Now, a lot of people claim that he cured them, right? So there's a pretty good chance that he had at least a placebo effect. If you're very, very nervous in certain circumstances, you aren't going to be able to perform, sexually, right? And so some people think that his goat implant worked and he got a lot of good word of mouth, right? A lot of good reputation for doing this thing because some people found it an effective treatment, right? It helped them psychologically to get over whatever the issue was. But also, a lot of people got infections and some even died, right? His reputation and the amount of money that he made almost made him the governor of Kansas, okay? And they had to come up with a very technical way of, I think it was that voters had to spell his name exactly correct in order for the vote to count. And it was only through doing really technical stuff like that they were able to avoid him becoming the governor of Kansas. All right. So he became very, very popular. Now, he eventually got run out of Kansas and run out of a lot of ways because people in the medical world were like, this guy doesn't have credentials. He's doing something that's very, very dangerous. We don't think that there's any clinical evidence that this is actually working. And so he went and started a radio station that was super high powered on the Mexico-Texas border, right? And because there weren't regulations, and because he was able to pay people off in the Mexico-Texas area, he was able to blast this pretty much all over the world, right? Like his tower was incredibly powerful and probably dangerously powerful. And he was able also to just sell his tonics, his tinctures, right? And convince pharmacies to sell them. It turns out, they were equally as clinically effective as the goat testicle. Maybe they worked in a placebo way, and the placebo effect is real, right? If you believe it and it actually works, then it works. But actually, clinically, it wasn't worth anything, and the tinctures didn't help. Eventually, there was a lawsuit by one of his rivals in the medical field, and some other people who had gotten infections, and the families of people who had died from the procedure. They basically sued him. They got him onto the stand, and eventually they were able to get him to more or less admit that his cures were ineffective, that he didn't have the right credentials, etc. He was shamed, and he eventually died penniless. Okay, so a very unusual case, but it is an actual case from history. Now, the reason that I bring this up is it's a complicated case. It's also a case that probably you will remember because it's so weird, but it's also something that we can kind of start to see how the different theories assess this case differently, okay? So for the virtue ethicist, if we want to ask, should John Brinkley have done these things? We need to ask, well, what was the effect on his life, right? Could he live well by doing these things? And was he a good person? Was he developing a bad character whenever doing these things? Okay? Now, I think that especially the scope of this life, it shows that this is why you don't scam people, right? It can make your life go very, very badly, and it affects other people. Okay, someone who is living a good life, we would not want to say that they're living a good life if they're scamming other people and eventually they get caught. If there's a lot of risk in there, you just wouldn't do those types of things. Most of us wouldn't choose to live the life that John Brinkley lived. Okay, was he a good person? Probably not, right? If you have to find ways constantly to lie to people because you know that your treatment isn't really all that effective, or if you have to lie that you're a doctor but you don't actually have that good of medical training, that does something to you, right? And it does something to your character that we don't think is good. So the virtue ethicist, again, is going to appeal to what is the trajectory of this person's life? Do we think that it's a meaningful or a worthwhile life? Does that make them into a better or a worse person? The virtue ethicist here is probably going to say that Brinkley had to develop lots of vices, and the trajectory of his life, or his life in general, is not a life that we would want to lead. Okay? That's how they're going to justify their judgments on this particular action. The utilitarian, on the other hand, is going to say, well, look, again, they can't say the action itself, implanting slices of goat testicle into men, or lying to people, those things aren't immoral in and of themselves. What makes things moral or immoral is whether it maximizes the good or minimizes the bad. And so you have to ask, on the whole, was more harm done than good, or more good done than harm? In this case, I think it's fairly easy to see, or maybe not, maybe it's not. Maybe the utilitarian has to be kind of ambivalent in this case. But I think that there's a lot of bad. The persons obviously who got infected and died suffered a lot of pain, right? They were out a lot of money. So I think in today's dollars, I think it was somewhere around $10,000 for the procedure, right? And especially these were like rural people, in Kansas that he was treating. That's a lot of money, okay? This might influence also, just like socially, how people trust medicine. It might influence how people trust science. You have to consider all of those bads. Brinkley himself, he had to deal with the anxiety of being found out. He had to deal with the anxiety of constantly moving and trying to skirt the authorities. Now, he did a lot of things like to counteract those things, and presumably got a lot of good things out of it. He got money, right? He got reputation. He actually, I think, is at least partially responsible, maybe majorly responsible for popularizing folk and country music, because his radio station, right, had to have programming, and he brought on local acts, not just like stuff that people already approved of, right? So there are good things that came out of his action. He helped some of the patients, right? It's not a cut and dry case where everyone was harmed by this, okay? And so the utilitarian doesn't think that certain things are right and wrong. They have to look at the consequences, the results, the effects. Do we think the effects were better or worse on the whole, right? And that's what's going to help utilitarians to justify the answer. And for the deontologists, we want to ask, can his actions respect others? Can they respect others' dignity? And could he intend to do those things with a pure will or a pure heart or the right kinds of reasons? Okay? And I think here, and especially Immanuel Kant himself, is going to say, you cannot lie to people and respect their dignity. Okay? Because people's dignity rests in their ability to think and make decisions. And if you are giving them false information, they cannot exercise their autonomy. They can't decide rightly what to do. You're giving them bad information. You are using them as a mere object or a means to achieve whatever you want, right? So he wanted to be wealthy, and he felt it was acceptable to lie to people in order to achieve that goal. Using people is not acceptable. It does not respect them. So the deontologist is going to say, absolutely, this is not okay, right? And there's maybe a more relevant case as to, could he rationally intend these types of things? I'm not going to go too much into this because we'll go into this whenever we talk about Kantian ethics. But you kind of think, could his intentions be right? Could they be pure whenever he's thinking about these things? Could he purely or innocently say, well, yeah, I want to lie to people to do this procedure so that I can take their money, so that I can help them? I don't know. It's hard to figure out that particular one, but that's how the deontologist is going to do it. So again, virtue ethicist, how does it relate to the character of John Brinkley? How does it affect other people's characters, right? How does it affect how he flourished, his life's trajectory, right? The utilitarian, how does it affect the results or the consequences? How does it affect what happened to most people, the greatest good for the greatest number? For the deontologist, is he able to do his duty in respecting the dignity of other people or in being rational or having a pure will? Okay? So that is hopefully a test case that helps us to kind of think about those things. I think that there's some additional things here that I just wanted to mention very quickly. And one is that there's something very strange here about the ambition. And I really like this quote by Montaigne. And it is this. There are two things I have always observed to be in singular accord: super celestial thoughts and subterranean conduct. So I think that there's something interesting here in the John Brinkley case of showing that Brinkley wanted to, go into medicine. He had lots of ambitions. He wanted to become governor, right? He wanted notoriety. He came from nothing. But those types of ambitions, they aren't always bad, but they very often can be. And Montaigne noticed here, and he's writing, 500 years ago, 400 years ago, that whenever you have these types of really high-minded ideas and really big ambitions and you're trying to do things, it's very often that people that have that will do very nefarious, bad, illicit things to accomplish them. Maybe not always, but he's saying, in my experience, they've always been hand in hand. You have really high ambitions. Chances are you're going to let morality take a side or a backseat to that, right? What's more important is you accomplishing your goals. So I think that this is also a tale about ambitions and a tale about the dangers that those things can have, right? I think that there's also something else here about vulnerability. People who are vulnerable can be exploited, okay? People who are ill or have illnesses, they want cures, okay? There's a way in which people who are sick and are in pain and looking for a way out, they want to believe a lot of different things. And you can do this, crystals, right? All sorts of alternative medicines. There's any number of things that ill people will buy into because they really want to try to find a way out of their illness. And that can be exploited by less than, scrupulous people, right? But I also think there's psychological things, insecurity, or maybe being very lost in life, being in a lot of psychological turmoil. That can also lead to insecurity that can be exploited. So one of the dangers in life, and so this is kind of how cults get people, for example, is to find people who are kind of mixed up. They don't know what they want. And what a cult often does is give people answers. They tell you exactly how life is. They give you a reason for everything, right? And that's what they do. Now, it's kind of like an unfortunate thing that just adult life is full of a lot of very unclear questions. And this class is going to make these questions more complicated. But that's just part of it. It's an unsexy truth of adult life that we have to learn how to tolerate ambiguity. And even whenever we don't know things for certain, we just kind of have to act, based on probabilities or basic uncertainties. That's just kind of how it is, right? So just be aware that people who are hurting or people who are confused, and this is anyone, myself included, at different points in my life, maybe even now, it can be exploited in certain ways, right? And the last thing that I want to say with this particular case, because what I think makes this case very, very interesting is that it's not an obvious case, all right? So in ethics and in history, a lot of people talk about Hitler because obviously he was a bad person and he did something very obviously bad, right? But the Brinkley case is not that obvious. And one thing that I want to remind you whenever you're studying human behavior or whenever you're trying to evaluate whether something is good or bad is that typically we all think that we're the heroes to our own story. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we all think that we're doing the right thing. Okay, this is an old sort of Socratic idea. Basically the idea that is like if you know the right thing, you're going to do the right thing, or whenever you do the right thing, it's because you think it was your best option. You might be misinformed, right? It doesn't mean that you actually know what's going on. It might not actually be the right thing for you, but you think that. So I think that whenever you're judging these particular cases, it also helps to be humble and to be curious and to really try to understand why was he doing these types of things, right? Now, maybe some people do just have deep psychological dissonance, or maybe people are just genuinely evil. But I think that much more often it's the case that we're usually somewhere in the middle and we're mixed. People are not usually all good or all bad. And I think that there's an especially important insight with human morality, where whenever you're looking, think of the person that you despise the most, even in politics. If you don't realize the ways in which you could become that person, you sort of are in danger of making yourself invulnerable to a lot of very human things. Inversely, if you look at people that you totally admire, and you think that, oh, they just have God-given talent, or they're just naturally better than me, there might be some, truth to that, right? Like I'm not, saying that certain people don't have certain aspects of that, but very often those kinds of things are said to absolve ourselves of responsibility to try and get better. Okay, so for example, I think like artistry and musicianship, those are really easy examples. That person is just really, really good at playing the guitar, right? Well, that person also probably played like 8 to 10 hours a day for years to develop that talent, right? But whenever we buy into the idea of genius or talent, we're basically saying, I couldn't be that way, but it's actually just like, I don't, want to put in the time. Yeah, okay, so that's what I want to say about that case. All right. Before we get much further into the class, I also want to talk about metaethics, okay? Now, this class isn't going to talk too much about metaethics. Some of the readings might allude to some of the ideas, so I wanted to introduce some ideas. And this, honestly, isn't the cleanest way of dividing up all of these issues, but it's all very, very complicated. But I wanted to try and make it a little more approachable by thinking about, well, what are the ways in which we search for or try to ground or try to speak about morality, right? Whenever we have deep disagreements, how can we diagnose what's going on? Or is there some sort of theory that's underlying the ethical theories? Metaethics is exactly that. What is behind ethics? What is underneath ethics? And these are the kinds of questions that metaethics is often trying to deal with. So whenever we're searching for the good, what are some different ways that we can search for it? Well, I think one, and this is not, again, like there's a lot of gaps in this particular thing because I can't cover everything in one semester. One option is maybe trying to consider something like divine command theory, where what we need to do, our ethics are based on some sort of relationship to a divine figure. And this could be done in a lot of different ways. It could be revelation, right? So it's some sort of personal relationship that God reveals something to you. It could be study of scriptures. So you think that something that is important is knowledge-based, and you just have to study things, right? Or it could be some sort of mystical experience. You have like a deep emotional, maybe even an erotic experience with the divine that informs you to do certain things. But the divine command theory says that divinity is one thing that helps us to understand kind of what's going on. Another aspect that we might do is this, like maybe this is something like methodological or epistemological naturalism, but just naturalism, focus on natural there. Maybe we could use empirical methods kind of like the sciences. Can we go out into our communities and see what happens whenever people do certain things? And is there something there that is observable, or at best case scenario, measurable, that can teach us what to do in particular cases? Maybe that seems like a good option. Maybe we can use the methods of social science to figure this sort of stuff out. Psychology is doing this with positive psychology, right? And I think that Aristotelians share a similar sort of lineage. Another option is called non-naturalism. And broadly, what I would say is whenever you do this, could you look at something like morality and see what has to be the case for moral codes to hold, right? Are there any necessary assumptions or necessary presuppositions for any ethical case that you can get at the common basis of the good or the right thing that helps us understand what's going on? And the last one is constructivism, okay? And just broadly, right, because this is a complicated theory, is there something that maybe most, all rational people would agree to, okay? So can we look at people who think through things, who have reasons for the things that they do, and do they all end up agreeing to something? Do they all, for example, end up agreeing that we should be building a just society that allows people to have something like free healthcare or protections from unlawful seizure of assets, right? Would all rational people agree to certain things? Okay, that's the question. Okay, so these are 4 different methods. And like I said, things get more complicated, but these are different ways that we can potentially think about how we approach whether we adopt a particular normative theory or whether we do something in a particular case. Is there a religious tradition we can lean on? Is there some sort of natural empirical method that we can do? Is there some sort of necessary presupposition or assumption there? Or is there something that we think that all rational people who could debate or talk about these things would probably agree to? All right. The last thing that I'll mention is basically rationalism or intellectualism. You'll hear me talk in both cases versus sentimentalism. This is basically reason versus emotion, thoughts versus feelings, okay? And this is also going to be really, really important as well. It doesn't fit into, necessarily or neatly into any of these camps, but I did want to put it here. Whenever we're thinking about what the right or the wrong thing to do in a particular scenario is, do we use something like our head, where we express things in sentences and we can debate and we can argue? Or do we use something like our heart that tells us maybe what we should do, or that pays attention to the pain of other people? Maybe it tells us something that isn't so easily expressed in a sentence, but it's something that we need to heed, right? Another way that you could think about this is thoughts, arguments, right? Versus intuitions, gut feelings, gut reactions, things that most people find okay. Certain philosophers, Peter Singer, are going to say, yeah, emotions are stupid. I don't care about your feelings. What I care about is, what leads to the best consequences. He's a utilitarian, right? Other people are going to say you can't so easily dismiss that, right? Aristotelians are going to say you need both, for example. Certain versions of David Hume's ethical theory are going to stress the sentimental aspects. Sympathy, right? Feminist care ethics, one of the things I'm leaving out for this semester, they're going to emphasize methods of care, right? So reason, emotion, intellect or emotion, basically thinking about things, debating things versus feeling things, that's also something that's relevant here that I wanted to give you an idea of. Grounding. Okay, so if we want to think what is the basis for moral claims or moral facts in the world, right? If I ask you if there's a moral fact of the matter, is there a fact of the matter as to whether killing an innocent person is right or wrong? Okay, what are the different answers that we could give there? Well, the first one is to say something nihilistic. Nihilism is the option that basically there is no moral fact of the matter. There's nothing out there that founds or grounds our moral theories. It's nothing, right? There's nothing. One option is subjectivism. So here, subjective, subject meaning a person, a single person. What the subjectivist is going to say is what grounds moral truths or makes something right or wrong is my individual preference or my individual belief. Okay, so if I believe that murdering an innocent person is wrong, then that makes it a grounded fact, right? That's what morality is trying to get at. It's not trying to get at something, objective or out there in the world or even social truths. It's about me and my preferences. Okay? Cultural relativism, and this is probably the sloppiest one that I'm defining here, but maybe it's what your culture says. Who knows what a culture is, right? But maybe it's something like what your group or community or the culture that you grew up in or your country, maybe it's what it says. And you go along with that, right? When in Rome. That's the idea here. So what grounds a moral fact? Well, what makes it right, it depends on the circumstances that you're in, okay? Now, there's a lot of really weird and tough problems. I'm just going to kind of gloss over them. But because you're bound to hear cultural relativism or relativism, you have to ask relative to what and how you cash out something like culture. But I think that it's a relevant answer here. And then the last one is objectivism, okay? And objectivism is basically going to say that there is something that grounds moral facts. It is, in fact, wrong to murder an innocent person. And it's not an individual preference, and it's not what a culture says, or like constructivism in the previous slide, right? It's not what rational people agree to. Rather, there's something else there. It's more than an individual preference, and it's more than agreement, right? There's something addition to that. Maybe it's a fabric of, maybe it's in the universe, maybe it's something we can observe, but the objectivist is going to say it goes beyond subjectivism, it goes beyond constructivism, it goes beyond agreement, right? There is a fact of the matter out there. Now, again, this is really complicated. It gets into a lot of really sticky debates in realism versus anti-realism, but I'm just trying to give you some of the big words that can help you assess some of the ideas in the readings. Okay. The last one that I want to talk about is what are we doing whenever we're expressing certain moral sentences? Okay. One camp is called cognitivism. And cognitivism basically is the idea that sentences like murder is bad, right? That those can be true or false. So if I say the sentence murder is bad, that's either true or false, right? We have to find a way of assessing that, and it makes sense to assess that in terms of truth or falsity, right? There is a fact of the matter out there. It can be right or wrong, okay? This is the way that most people kind of think that morality works. I think most normal people. But in metaethics and in the last century, non-cognitivism has also gotten a lot of really important people to write about and a lot of really important people to think that this is right. But they're basically going to say that, look, whenever you are saying a sentence about morality, murder is bad, that's actually the kind of thing that isn't truth apt. It isn't something that's properly true or false. There is no truth or falsity or fact of the matter about that. Or whenever we're assessing the sentence, murder is bad, what that's not doing is expressing a fact, right? So a cognitivist fact could be something like hydrogen has 1 proton, okay? We think that that sentence is true, right? It is something that you can say is either true or false. And in this case, it's true, right? Do we think the same about this sentence, right? Twilight is a beautiful movie, okay? If we're a cognitivist about aesthetic value, we might say that that sentence could be true or false, right? We just need to know whether, what the truth-making conditions are, what makes that true or false. But some people are going to say, oh, well, now we're getting into areas where maybe there is no truth or falsity here. Maybe there's something else going. Whenever people are talking about artworks in that way, they're not talking in truth or falsity. They're playing some other game, right? And that's what non-cognitivists are saying. Whenever you're saying things like murder is bad, it's not like the scientific discourse or something that, you're talking about facts of the matter, truth or falsity. One example of non-cognitivism that makes this very, very clear is emotivism. And this is the idea that whenever we're saying things like murder is bad, we're not trying to express something that's true or false. What we're trying to do is express our feelings. So if I say murder is bad, what I'm trying to do is show you that I feel very intensely and very negatively about murder. Okay? So maybe it's the case that language, whenever we're talking about morality, isn't trying to discover facts about the world, but what it's trying to do is express the feelings of the speaker. Okay? And so that's something that's really important to consider as well. So naturally, there's a lot there. There's a lot there. That's so much. The stuff is going to become easier as we go throughout the semester, but I wanted to introduce a lot of these ideas because they help us out. Okay? So just to recap, be very, very careful about confirmation bias. So whenever we're trying to figure out how to live, or whenever we feel very strongly about something, consider whether you have thought about alternative opinions or tried to disprove yourself, right? Whenever you're dealing with an opponent, try to be charitable, okay? And try to find the best of the examples and try to find stuff that's attached to life, but also expressed very, very clearly. Whenever we're assessing different moral values, consider character. Consider the trajectory of life, whether it's a good or a meaningful life. Consider the intentions up to the action, the mindset, and whether you're respecting people. And consider the consequences, what happens after the fact, and whether that affects the values, right? And whenever we get really bogged down and we're in a disagreement, maybe we can diagnose that because certain people are relying on religion. Certain people are relying on scientific methods. Certain people are relying on philosophical sort of looking at the assumptions. Certain people are relying on, other methods of understanding what's going on. Maybe it's the case that we think there are different grounds for morality. Maybe I think that it's all just individual opinion, right? Maybe we think that it's a culture. Maybe we think that it's rational people. Maybe we think that there are facts of the matter, right? Or maybe we think that just talking about morality is just very, very different than other types of talking. And that's a certain thing as well. One of the main reasons that I bring all of this up now is because one of the tough things about talking about these things is please don't say, well, isn't this all just a matter of semantics? Okay, maybe. Maybe it is a matter of how we're interpreting things or talking about meaning. But that's your job in this class, to try to figure out what these terms mean. Okay? So saying, isn't it just all semantics, is not that helpful. What makes you say that? What evidence is there for that? How can we roughly interpret what's going on here? Dig deeper to try to figure out those things. The other thing that I would strongly caution you against is saying, well, isn't this just your opinion, or isn't it all just like subjective, right? Look, you can have that opinion. You can be a subjectivist. Lots of smart people are. But realize what you're doing whenever you're saying that. If you're saying that isn't it all just subjective, right? You're basically saying that if someone doesn't believe that murdering innocent people in all or most cases is wrong, that's okay as long as they sincerely believe it, right? Maybe you're okay with that particular conclusion. Just realize that that's what you're saying. So there are a lot of natural impulses to making certain types of arguments or saying certain things. Hopefully this lesson has given you basic vocabulary and basic categories that can help you to understand what's going on. So thank you so much for sitting through that lesson. I appreciate your attention, and I can't wait to talk about these issues with you next time. See you later.